you could call him the father of the three-point shot, and nobody knows that. I mean, the reason, Steph Curry and Caitlin Clark, they owe a debt to Abe Saperstein, and they don't know it, I don't think. But he was the first person to do that in league play and showed, what an exciting kind of innovation it could be in basketball.
They are the authors of Globetrotter, How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports. We welcome Mark and Matthew Jacob onto Hoopsology. Welcome.
Thanks.
Thanks
for joining the show. Really appreciate it. Before we delve into the book, we have a bit of a tradition. Our show focuses on the top headlines of basketball, where we delve into basketball culture and what makes this sport so great. So for both of you, you can take it any way you want to. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
Oh, wow. I'll go first. University of Arkansas college graduate, and it must have been maybe a year or two after I graduated. In the mid-1980s, University of Arkansas is in the NCAA tournament. They're playing Louisville in one of the first couple of rounds. The famous U.S. Reed shot right at half court that sinks right as the gun sounds. And that was just amazing. I was at a horse race track for the Arkansas Derby, and hundreds of people were crowded around a radio listening to that call on the radio. So that was a pretty amazing moment.
Mine was last basketball season, college basketball season, just when we finished, we turned in the book, and my wife took me to the Northwestern Purdue game here I live in Evanston, Illinois. And it was a fantastic game. Zach Edney was, dominating for Purdue. Northwestern ended up winning in overtime. It was a full house and just an incredible game. Maybe one of the best basketball games I've ever seen. So I didn't have to go back very far to remember that one. No. I did see the Globetrotters once when I was a kid, too, and then Matt and I saw them when we were doing research for the book.
No, that's amazing. Speaking of the book, I find this really fascinating, and we've had plenty of authors on the show, and I always like to delve into the creative process, but we never had two authors on the show at the same time who both worked on the book simultaneously. So can you kind of delve into when you were offered the project, what intrigued you in terms of writing it, and kind of, were there any pain points? Were there any that surprised you in terms of this creative process, in terms of writing this book, at the same time simultaneously?
Yeah, I can talk about a little bit of the process, sort of the origination of the concept. I guess that maybe Mark can talk a little more about the process if he'd like. But Mark and I wrote a book back in 2010. It was published called "What the Great Ate." One of the chapters deals with sports stars and how foods and diets sort of affected their game and the value they placed on them and some of those idiosyncrasies and such. So we talked, over the years about maybe doing a second book. And I was thinking it'd be great to do a biography. And we kept trying to think, who would be the ideal person? Who could we think of? And it is kind of ironic that the person we came up with was someone who grew up in Mark's backyard. On the north side of Chicago. And it was a friend of Mark's, Mark can talk more about this, who kind of said, hey, are you aware of this guy who started the Globetrotters and grew up in Chicago? He was an immigrant from Europe. And the more we heard about it, what's so funny is I think every 2 or 3 weeks while we were going and doing some research or, digging through the newspapers.com archives, invariably I would text Mark or he would call me. We would go, I can't believe no one's ever written a biography about this guy. Here's what I just found, right? So we had kind of this amazing kind of reinforcement of it. But I think, the concept we settled on, we both are sports fans, so that was kind of a natural, but we also both like sports kind of approached in a broader social and cultural context of what it meant, the implications it had for that particular point in time. And so for so many reasons, I think that's where we landed on this.
Yeah, a friend of mine named Richard Cahan just said, hey, have you thought about this? He knew we were looking for a biography. And he said, what about Abe Saperstein? And he said he's an author too. And he said, many years earlier, he had tried to reach out to the family unsuccessfully. And so I said, well, maybe I'll try again. And the truth is that Abe Saperstein was kind of a controversial figure in a way. I mean, here he was he started this black basketball team back when black players were considered not necessarily superior athletes in a team way. I mean, there were a lot of ridiculous myths back then that black players weren't good enough to play with white players in basketball. Things that if you told somebody that today, they'd think you were insane. But that's what people thought, And so Abe Saperstein starts his team. They go out on the road. They're hardly even making enough money to eat, at first, and they just year after year after year. This is a 5'3" Jewish guy and 5 black guys in a Model T Ford going out on the road to predominantly white towns, which is, by the way, why they call them the Harlem Globetrotters, because they weren't from Harlem and they were not Globetrotters. They were just 5 guys from the South Side of Chicago playing basketball, but Harlem signaled black guys, and Globetrotters was part of Abe's, hype. One of the things that really amused us in doing this book is Abe Saperstein was this crazy promoter. He mailed boxes of apples to sports writers. He did all kinds of crazy stuff to promote himself, and he wasn't above kind of overestimating how great his team was. So he called them the Globetrotters, even though they really hadn't been anywhere. And anyway, so just as far as getting the book going, so I reached out to the family, finally got them to engage with me. What I'm saying is they were hesitant in a way, and part of the reason I don't think there's ever been a biography of Abe Saperstein before was while he was really important in exposing black athletic talent in the middle of the last century. By the time that the 50s and the 60s rolled around, he was in charge of a team that was kind of a team of clowns who was not really considered by the NBA snobs, didn't underestimated how good they were as far as basketball players and thought they were just kind of, jesters. And this was a civil rights movement. And I think that a lot of black people wanted to be thought of as people who could be doctors, lawyers, and, U.S. senators, not necessarily jesters amusing mostly white audiences. So I think to some extent, Abe's reputation got caught up in the whole civil rights movement, and that's why I think some of his great accomplishments have been underappreciated.
So, Mark or Matthew, if I can have you maybe zoom in on the origins of that team. You mentioned the name and the promotion and the cause for those names, but in terms of the mechanics of things, was it really, as you mentioned, this 5-person, maybe 6-person with Abe there, just tour, basically arranging these games against local teams and then moving to the next town? What did the mechanics of that look like?
They did go from town to town, night after night. They played in barns. They played in empty swimming pools. They would play all kinds of different places, and they really struggled in the early years. I feel like that it was just an unlikely thing for them to ever succeed. So they were from Chicago. They would travel up into Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and they every year in Iowa especially, and every year they'd kind of expand their footprint. And they finally went to the Pacific Northwest and were extremely popular there, especially in British Columbia also. And then just year after year, he kept on doing this. And, Matt made a good point when we were talking one time and said, this is not something where you had email and spreadsheets where you could you could contact sports writers that way, or you could arrange games that way. The reason that Abe Saperstein got involved in the first place was that these black athletes on the South Side needed, as they put it, somebody with a white face to make arrangements with all these small towns in the Midwest, these white towns, someone who they would trust to make arrangements to do games. And they played a wide variety of teams. They would play factory teams in some towns. They would play college teams in other towns. they would play other touring teams. There were a variety of touring teams back in that era, such as the House of David. I don't know if you ever heard of them. This was a religious commune in Michigan, and all the people, the men in the commune had really long beards. But in order to promote their commune, they would go on baseball and basketball tours, and they were barnstormers. And that's how the House of David got known. They played the Globetrotters and played a lot of other teams. Various people would make money by going barnstorming. Babe Didrikson, the famous female athlete, she played against the Globetrotters once. It was a lot of picking up games, figuring out where you could get a game, and just wandering around the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest. And also should be remembered, they were doing this during the Depression. So at first. And so there were a lot of reasons why they would fail. And they succeeded because of A, the talent of the black athletes, and B, Abe's refusal to fail. His incredible energy. Matt and I tell the story in the book about him calling up a sports writer at 2 a.m. to commiserate about why he thinks his team isn't playing quite as well as it should play. And so I don't know if the guy ever slept. He was just this amazing dynamo.
So I want to ask you both, this is so interesting because just going over this book, it's interesting that I think the game of basketball is very unique, that it can be disrupted and it can be modified to be a different form compared to other sports, like we're seeing now, just with the big three, Unrivaled's coming. We've seen even within the mid 2000s, like street ball become really popular. What makes basketball so adaptable to be modified and, I guess, repackaged for a new audience compared to, you don't see that for football, you don't see that for baseball or hockey, where those other forms of it really catch fire. But the Globetrotters is a national institution for many decades. But yet other sports that might be able to modify themselves, you don't see them catch on. But yeah, basketball seems to always evolve in different types of ways. Do you know why that's the case compared to other sports?
Boy, that I'd love to speculate, but I mean, it is a great question because I think one of the things that Mark and I really appreciated was, as we're doing research, you look back at the 1920s, late that decade, the Globetrotters get started. What a different game it was. I mean, Mark goes through the rule changes and things that we take for granted today that you couldn't do back then. Back in the 1920s, for example, sports writers who covered basketball sometimes used the word passers as a synonym for players. And the reason was that was what the game looked like back then. Players on offense spent a lot of time passing the ball back and forth before anyone would dare shoot, even if they had an open shot. And that's one big reason, not the only reason, but it's a big reason why the scores of the games were so low. And, there were debates over how often should we use the bounce pass versus other passes. And it's kind of interesting how that sport really stayed very organic and very fluid, like you're saying. And I think, the Globetrotters came along, and I don't think Abe, said to himself, well, we're going to change the way basketball is played in any sort of conscious sense. But, this sport was pretty slow and tedious by today's standards. And the Globetrotters really transformed the tempo and the style. I don't have to tell you guys, I mean, in the 80s, the term Showtime evolved to describe NBA play somewhat in general, but in particular the LA Lakers, where you had guys like Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, James Worthy, who were known for their up-tempo style, but also they were out to win games, but they were also out to impress the fans. They really did it with style. And the no-look passes, the run-and-gun offense, I'm not going to say the Globetrotters were the reason for that, but they certainly were a key element influencing things. Saperstein recruited several of his Globetrotters from Tennessee State University. Their head coach during the 1950s, a guy named John McClendon, a lot of basketball writers have credited him with developing the fast break offense. So, I mean, Saperstein was seeing in some of those players the physicality, the agility, the quickness that I think he appreciated and said, yeah, I want them on my team. So, as far as what is it about basketball that perhaps explains why it has been somewhat malleable in terms of just changing the look and the product, how different it looks from maybe decade to decade. That would be a great exploration for a book on its own. But I think it's fascinating to me to see how many of the elements that were considered quirky and strange and trick-like, the no-look passes, how integrated they have become over time in the NBA.
I think one reason for the way basketball is treated in this country compared to other sports is that it's an American game. It was invented in the United States. And, most people don't realize that after every made basket, they used to do a jump ball at half court. They did that till 1938, and then they changed it. And, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, but to me, one of the big things that Matt and I discovered that we didn't know when we started the project was that Abe Saperstein pioneered the three-point shot in basketball. You could call him the father of the three-point shot, and nobody knows that. I mean, the reason, Steph Curry and Caitlin Clark, they owe a debt to Abe Saperstein, and they don't know it, I don't think. But he was the first person to do that in league play and showed, what an exciting kind of innovation it could be in basketball.
Yeah, it's amazing the list of things that you learn about in this book of things that Saperstein pioneered. A quick question about Saperstein, and it's certainly complicated to judge anyone's motivations or things like this. And I don't mean this question in any way to put down Saperstein or anything like this, but in terms of motivations for him and kind of understanding his drive to do all the things that he did with the Globetrotters and beyond. Is there a love of basketball in particular that's tied with that? Or is basketball kind of the mechanism where he was able to kind of use that drive that he had? I don't know. Complicated question.
Yeah, I don't know that I would say, he had this singular love for basketball. He loved sports, certainly in general, and baseball and basketball were two of his were probably his two favorite sports without question. And he actually was doing some promoting of a black semi-pro baseball team in Chicago before he launched the Globetrotters. He has an interesting history in baseball, helping to get Satchel Paige to the major leagues, for example, and that sort of thing. But I think for him, the commonality that Mark and I saw was that Abe Saperstein's approach to sports was, it's not just a game, it's a show. You've got to dazzle the fans, and you can't give it all away, right? Because the next time they show up, you've got to show them just a little bit more, or show them something they haven't seen before. And I think when I think of Abe Saperstein, if he could look down from heaven, we're making an assumption here, he would be thrilled to know that the NBA does not just have an all-star game, right? They brand it as the all-star weekend, and they have a slam dunk contest. That is so vintage. Like, that would be exactly what he would say. What do you mean you're not having a slam dunk contest, right? I mean, he really believed that you pull out every element of style and finesse that you can and give it to the fans. I mean, if you were a fan, he really was your advocate in many ways, more so than almost from the kind of executive and team side, I guess. He
really kind of pioneered these lavish halftime shows during basketball games. He had a truncated version of a Broadway show at halftime one year that traveled with him, and he would have table tennis players. He'd have jugglers. He would have acrobats. He had Althea Gibson, the famous black tennis star. She toured with him, one summer, and he was trying to entertain fans. He loved sports, and I think he was a real advocate for the fans, and he was a visionary too. I mean, for example, he was complaining that baseball games were too slow, 50, 60, 70, years ago. I mean, half a century ago, he was complaining that baseball games were too slow, and Major League Baseball decided to do something about it just a few years ago. Same thing with variable ticket pricing in sports. That Abe was talking about that in the 1950s. and it, it took decades later for people to wake up and do that. Abe was talking about expanding the NBA to the West Coast years before they actually did it. And then they screwed him over and didn't give him a team, even though he wanted a team. They moved the Minneapolis Lakers there instead of giving him a new franchise in Los Angeles. And that's why he started the American Basketball League in 1961, which is where the three-point shot first began league play.
A quick timeout from the interview to request a favor. If you love our interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to hear more interviews from the world of basketball, featuring journalists from SB Nation, ESPN, CBS Sports, and The Athletic. Now, back to the interview.
Did the league see Saperstein as, I don't know, dangerous or a threat to get involved with?
Yeah, Mark can talk at great length about this. He did a little more deeper dive on this end than I did. But, it was a weird situation. On the one hand, I think there were points where they thought, okay, look, we can work with this guy, let's see what we can do working together. But Saperstein, I think, had some really good ideas, and I think he was ahead of his time. And I think the league was a little less inclined to try and move to the West Coast, for example. They were very cautious. But I think part of his problem too was one of the pluses, if you were a sports writer, was this guy was very quotable. One of the negatives for Abe was some of the things he was quoted saying. He took some shots at NBA commissioner, at other league owners, and said, why aren't they doing this? And this at the same moment where you're saying, hey, you should hand me a franchise, it's probably not the best language to use. And, so he threw some barbs their way. But I think in retrospect, you sort of look back at him today and you can kind of see why Abe was restless and felt like, these guys don't get it and they should be doing this. So I don't know, Mark, you have probably a good perspective to lend.
Well, there's several things going on here. So Abe helped save the NBA. I mean, this idea that the NBA was an instant success, it wasn't. It was a really struggling league in the late 40s. And early 50s. And the Globetrotters would do double headers with the NBA teams. They'd have one league game and then the Globetrotters would play somebody. And at first they had Globetrotters play the first game, but so many fans started leaving after the Globetrotters game that they switched it up to where they had the league game first and then the Globetrotters played next. And back when the NBA finally racially integrated in 1950, part of the reason that they may have hesitated is they were worried that Saperstein would be mad at him, because at that point, Saperstein had the choice of all the best black players in the country. And so they didn't want to tick off Abe by doing that, because those games with the Globetrotters, those doubleheaders were their big cash cows during the season. And they were keeping them alive. So in that way, Abe was keeping the NBA alive. But there was an interesting dynamic there where as the NBA became better and more financially stable, the Globetrotters were changing too. By the mid 50s, he had the Washington Generals as a kind of a pretend team that they were traveling with, that they would play well, but just well enough to lose to the Globetrotters. And it became became less of a real sports competition and more of just a show. Now, that was fine for the Globetrotters, and they made a lot of money doing that. But I think the NBA was a little worried about their credibility in that score because the Globetrotters weren't just a plain old sports team anymore. They were kind of a circus.
So it's very interesting. Both of you discussed how really Abe was kind of one of the first sports disruptors. That term gets used a lot nowadays, but back when he was forming the Globetrotters, he was very much disruptor of his time. And I'm just thinking with sports, there's always this kind of push and pull of keeping the authenticity of sports and molding it entertainment. But it's pretty obvious that integrating entertainment is integral to the sporting experience. Take a look at the Super Bowl. I mean, that has the biggest halftime show, biggest 15 minutes on the planet. And that is not related to football. So why do you think there's just this resistance to add more entertainment elements just into sports and keep that authenticity when it's been proven over and over again that the consumer actually wants infusion of entertainment? I mean, we saw this a couple of days ago with the UFC and the Sphere, and just how they were able to tell a story of a different country, as well as integrate it into their fights. And Abe was, I think, it could be somewhat credited to what happened with this spear a couple of days ago, just in terms of the Globetrotters, just in terms of infusing more, just, I wouldn't even say outside the box ideas, but just new elements to the presentation of how basketball should be viewed. So why do you think there's just still resistance, just in terms of, incorporating newer ideas into more traditional sports?
Boy, that's a great question. I think, sometimes the resistance is a reflection less of, I don't want to do that, but more a statement of, I don't know how to do that. Right. I mean, a lot of the people who make it to the helm of executives of the various NBA teams, NFL teams, into the commissioner's office, come up through the sport, and they're not experts on marketing in a broader sense. Obviously, they have a VP for marketing. They have somebody who is hired to play that role. But a lot of the people who are kind of sitting around and making decisions as team owners, that's kind of outside of their lane. And I think they're a little uncomfortable. And ever since the infamous Super Bowl blouse event, right, people are sort of like, well, we kind of like halftime shows, but maybe we want to, dial it back a little bit, right? I think there's kind of this unknown a little bit, whereas the sport is known. They know the players. They know the rhythm. I think they just feel more comfortable with that. So the idea of doing more cross-marketing and doing more lavish shows, and signing agreements with influencers, I think, the NFL, for example, I think is kind of struggling. They, all the games, every time the Chiefs are on TV, they show you a clip up at the luxury box, and you see Taylor Swift up there. And they make a quick reference to it, but the fact that she made a recent political decision, it kind of makes them all the more like, okay, we don't want to go there. Let's be careful. I think it's kind of just, it's a whole different set of terrain, I think, for many of them. And so there's just more of a hesitance. It's not so much we don't want to do that, but how do we do that? And I think caution tends to trump being more innovative and being more adventurous.
Well, and it's also more work. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, in doing this book, Matt and I think we were just blown away by how much work Abe did, and how, and I mean, these guys are touring the world. By the 50s, they're touring Europe every year. They're in South America. They're going into these jungle regions of the Philippines to play games. I mean, they're just all over the place, and it's hard. Matt did extensive research into these portable floors, right? They had basketball floors stationed in all parts of the world so that they could use them and move them. By what did Matt? Did they use trucks or they use tankers?
Yeah, well, they had barges that would, and they would ship them over by boat. And they had them stationed in different parts of the world. They had one in Southeast Asia, I think around the Philippines. But yeah, because they were going to a lot of countries where the regulation floor wasn't there. The tours that the Globetrotters did overseas, I think, are also kind of one of the unknown facets of their history. The 1950s were in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the Secretary of State in the U.S. sends memoranda around to his top diplomats saying, we need to know what this team is doing, what their itinerary is. He sent their 1952 itinerary to every U.S. embassy across the globe and said, if they come to your country, you show them every courtesy, you assist them. He saw the Globetrotters as one of the best goodwill ambassadors that the United States had. And a big part of that reason was the Soviet Union was trying to exploit the situation, all the racial strife going on in the U.S., the Central High crisis, Birmingham, right? And so they're telling people over and over again, yeah, the U.S. says they're for freedom. We'll take a look at this. And Dean Acheson knew it was a vulnerability. So Secretary of State Dean Acheson says, hey, let's promote this team. Let's help them set up games. You had embassies that were literally printing tickets and helping them with local publicity. And so, I mean, I think if you read the clippings today, the State Department was described as being supportive of what the Globetrotters were doing abroad, but the details, how much they were doing, they were even helping to convert currency, because in some of those countries, being paid in local currency, they could only take so much of it out of the country. So the local embassy was saying, hey, Abe Saperstein, bring it over. We'll figure this out. When you get back to Washington, you'll have a receipt. You'll go to Washington and you'll get the full amount in US dollars. So, I mean, there was this elaborate kind of behind the scenes effort to lift up the Globetrotters and really help them be that ambassador for the country.
This is a thing in the book that we really break new ground in. I mean, there's more about that than has ever been in a book before, about how the Globetrotters were really a propaganda instrument during the Cold War. And it's all the stuff about that, about touring with Jesse Owens and him coming back to Berlin, after, years after the 1936 Olympics, which reminds me, Abe was friends with some of the greatest athletes of the century. He was friends with Jesse Owens. We interviewed Jesse Owens' daughter, and she told us how much her father valued his friendship with Abe. He was friends with Bill Veeck, another audacious promoter from Chicago. Will Chamberlain loved playing with the Globetrotters. He said he had more fun playing with them than anyone else. And he was pals with Abe. So another thing that our research found and that the book reflects is Abe he was kind of Forrest Gump but a sports producer. I mean, he would run into famous people all the time. And he wanted that. I mean, he really wanted to be kind of a famous celebrity. And he succeeded to a large extent.
Mark and Matthew, last question before we let you go. When readers pick up this book, what is the main point do you want just your audience just to leave with once they put the book down and just reflect on just not only the Globetrotters, but as Abe's legacy?
Wow. Great question. I think, Mark and I talked about this a lot by phone, by text, as we were coming up with a book. And, I said, I think when you read about Abe Saperstein and everything he had going on, and of course the showcase of that was the Globetrotters, it's a reminder that history is messy, that we do not live in a world with only two buckets of heroes and villains. There were some things that Abe Saperstein said and wrote that by today's standards, you're rolling your eyes, you're wincing, but more often than not, he was on the right side. I mean, he took a group of talented athletes and gave them a platform they wouldn't have had any other time and any other way at that point in time. And in the process, he affected how the game is played, and introduced the 3-point shot. So I mean, I think he changed he changed how sports are played, but I think also he had an impact on race relations. And I think that it's something that's always hard to measure, right? But as more and more fans saw this team play, and when the game, we didn't really have much chance to talk about, but the 1948 game they played where they beat the Minneapolis Lakers, one of the best teams, if not the best at that time, suddenly people are like, wow, these guys aren't just tricksters, like they're talented athletes. And indeed they were. So I think it really demonstrated there should be a place in professional basketball for Black men.
Yeah, I won't add much because I think Matt said it really well. But it's a real window into the America and the role of sports in the middle of the last century. There's funny stuff in the book. There's super serious stuff in the book. It deals with racism, with horrible racism and anti-Semitism because Abe was Jewish, but it deals with a lot of ambition and a lot of audaciousness and a lot of fearlessness. Abe was fearless. Abe wanted to make friends with everyone around the world, and made a ton of friends. And he wasn't afraid to fail. I mean, he was, and I don't know. I felt like, all told, after we finished doing all the research and writing it, I came away thinking that Abe was inspirational because he showed that people could take chances and they could succeed and they could fail and then they could come back and do something different and better. And I mean, it's an amazing story. He's really underappreciated, and I really hope that this book changes that.
Matthew and Mark, thank you very much for spending some time with us. Please let our audience know where they can find the book, also where they can find you on social media, and any other projects you're working on as well.
Yeah, well, markjacobbooks.com is a good place to go. Mark has written more books than I have, but right on the homepage, there's information about this book, Globetrotter, and it is available on Amazon and Rowman and Littlefield and Barnes & Noble and all the major booksellers. Mark, I don't know if you have any projects you want to mention about that you're working
Well,
on.
I actually have, I do have I write a Substack on politics and media called Stop the Presses, and that's at stopthepresses.news. But that has nothing to do with sports, but it's another interest of mine. And I'm on Twitter at, I wish I could still call Twitter. I'm not going to call it X, but I'm Mark Jacob 16 there on Twitter. And so that's about it. But the books is just going to be coming into stores. It's easy to find on Amazon, anywhere else. Globetrotter, not plural, just singular. Globetrotter. How Abe Saperstein changed the world of sports.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, gentlemen.